Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
We have made history, so said Ronald Reagan after he and General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Pact, the so-called INF Pact. Are we safer today because of that? Can we trust these Russians? Are we on the road, perhaps, to a peaceful, maybe even friendly coexistence with our arch enemies? Or are there going to be bigger issues, human rights, Afghanistan, Central America, the Middle East, that will preclude any real significant progress? Our panelists today on Public Affairs Roundtable to answer these questions are John Barber from the History Department at Ball State, Tom Sargent from Ball State's Political Science Department, and John Rouse, our executive producer and a political science faculty member. Tom, I guess the first question is, are we safer today for what President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev have done?
Well, if you mean are we safer because some missiles have been or about to be reduced in number, I think the answer is no, probably not, because I don't think that they were militarily all that significant. I think we're maybe a bit safer in the sense that the two countries have agreed on something, and they've agreed on something in the military field, and a treaty has been signed after long, prolonged negotiations, difficult negotiations, and so that, in that sense, I think we're safer. Somebody said the other day, well, maybe peace is about to break out. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but I think that certainly I'm delighted that the treaty has been signed, and I think it does signal that there is a bit of a new era, or at least a different turning in the post-war relations between the Soviet Union and the United States.
John Rouse, we've stumbled into this area after Reykjavik. Was that a success? Was it not? There's some differences, but obviously nothing of substance came of it. Is this treaty now that we have, is this a revolutionary?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's anything that has occurred in this century that has been revolutionary except for the period between 1939 and 1945. That was the most revolutionary period, in my estimation, in this century, probably in the history of mankind, because the ground rules, the whole politics, the economics for the East-West battle for the last 50 years was set up at that time. The result of that, in terms of the various philosophical focuses, capitalism, Marxism, so I don't think this one event is very revolutionary. It is indeed a restructuring. In fact, the word that Mr. Gorbachev uses oftentimes is the word perestroika, which means restructuring. So we indeed have a restructuring, a potential restructuring, a changing of the structure of the relationship between our country and the Soviet Union. And that is indeed very important. Not so sure how revolutionary it is.
John Barber, there's a Christian Science Monitor, perhaps Wall Street Journal, NBC News poll, and I'm skeptical of polls, but it indicates that the Americans, in terms of approval rating of Gorbachev, is over 50%, and President Reagan not much better than that. While I think that sort of thing begs for a context, is there some indication that perhaps we're beginning to trust these Russians who we've been told for so many years we cannot trust?
I think that to some extent we feel much more trusting toward Gorbachev, but I don't see a drastic change in that respect. I think for a long time Americans are going to remain fundamentally suspicious. We're inclined to be hopeful every time there's this new leader who comes along, and we'll think, well, maybe this is the one. But I think we have an ambivalent kind of feeling about it. We always hope that things will be much better, a new kind of relationship. But deep inside, I think most Americans keep feeling like, no, you still can't trust them, not at all. And I think President Reagan's repeating of that line about trust but verify is an indication of that kind of ambivalent feeling. I really do.
Can I just add that point? See me, trust is not a word that ought to be applied here, nor is the word sincere. States don't behave that way. Sovereign states behave in ways which are in their interests. And the treaty's been signed now. The treaty's been, or will be, hopefully ratified and put into effect because two great sovereign states believe it's in their mutual interest to do that. It's in their mutual interest to try and develop some kind of new relationship. As long as they feel that way, then we're in good shape. As long as it's dependent entirely on trust, then I think we've got a problem. I think we need to expect Soviet Union will live up to its obligations as long as it's in its interest to do so. And we need to make sure that it's always in their interest to do so. That's one of the reasons why, incidentally, I think SDI still remains an important element. The President is determined to make it in the interest of the Soviet Union to want to live up to its obligations, just as it will be in our interest to live up to our obligation.
If I can go back to another focus upon revolution, let's go back to our own revolution 200 years ago. And I think as we look at that revolution and look at independence, one of the basic values of our historical experience is that we do not trust absolute systems. And in the perspective of the American people, the Soviet system is a very absolute totalitarian system. And I think that reason is a reason why Americans instinctively do not trust the Soviets.
I can understand why those kinds of remarks are made, and I don't know who's correct about this. I do have a different opinion. I don't think the Soviets since Stalin's time have been a totalitarian system. Dictatorship, yes. They're run by a small group of people. The Politburo usually has 15 to 20 people in it. They have the most power. But there was one case in which Khrushchev was kicked out by the Politburo. They called in the Congress of Soviets. The Congress of the Party, rather, had about 400 people there. He was voted back in. The power centers shift somewhat in the Soviet Union from time to time. And it's not really nearly as absolutist as we think. It's not even as absolutist as some Soviet leaders want it to be.
Well, but John, if you look at the very focus of Gorbachev, he focuses upon the word glasnost, openness. And it may be true that there has been a lot more democracy in the Politburo than I'm conscious of, but I think in the perception of the American people, it is one of absoluteness in the Politburo.
I'm not denying that we see it that way. I'm saying that we see it incorrectly. The Soviet system has never been as absolute as we imagine it. That doesn't mean it's good from our point of view.
Nor has
it doesn't mean it's very free.
Right, and nor has our system been as democratic as we've advocated.
No, that's right. I also think that the change in Soviet-American relations between 1939 and 45 was not nearly that revolutionary. Our history of hostility with the Russians goes back before Soviet times. And I think, if anything, the period 39 to 45 was a revolution in the sense that we were getting along well because we had a common enemy. And then after that, it's back to the old ball game. The difference is that we become the two leading powers after 1945. And we have a lot more strength after 1945, and we become the arbiters of the world after 1945, and that's the real revolution from 1945 on.
Yeah, it was revolutionary in this sense. There were 55 million people that died during World War II. The UN was set up after that point, and after the failure of the League of Nations, that mechanism did come into being. And so in that sense, in the history of the world, I don't know that 55 million people have been extinguished from the face of the earth. 6 million Jews, the establishment of Israel occurred because of World War II. So in that sense, it was revolutionary.
Let me shift this back a little bit toward what that revolutionary question started with about the arms agreement. I think that I'm almost inclined to apply the term revolutionary to this, because we've been building nuclear weapons fairly steadily since 1944. We have never stopped. We built them slowly from 44 to 50. We built them as fast as we could from 1950 to right now. Right now, we are producing as many nuclear warheads as we can turn out. The only limit on the number produced is production capacity. We have never destroyed a nuclear weapon except to remake it into a new and better one. Now, what the Soviets and the Americans, they've both been doing that. And what they both agreed to do is to dismantle some nuclear weapons. It is a small number, 3 to 4%. But that's 2,300 for the Soviets. That's 300 or 400 for the United States, and they're going to do away with them. That is a very drastic change, and I think that borders on being a revolutionary agreement. Not only that, the Soviets have been saying since 1955, I've never heard an American say this on public television. They've been saying since 1955 they would agree to on-site inspection if we could work out the terms. Well, finally, both sides have gotten together and agreed to on-site inspection, and they signed that yesterday. They're going to be looking at one of each other's missile production facilities. They're going to be looking at a base in England where we are dismantling cruise missiles. That is a drastic change. And I think that borders on being revolutionary.
Well, I agree with that. I agree with John's point. I don't think militarily it's particularly substantive, but I do think that from the standpoint of style and relationship, it is very important. Yeah. Revolutionary, you can say that or not, but it is an important event. No question about that.
Are Americans looking at this as Gorbachev's treaty? Are they looking at it as that this man who has perhaps shown us a peek behind the steel curtain is in fact a policy of his new and improved government, and that if Gorbachev goes, and perhaps that steel curtain, that steel trap, will slam shut again?
I think Americans are looking at it that way, and I think the Europeans are too, to some extent. A commentator said this morning that people have forgotten that the 0-0 option was Reagan's proposal. And
we reminded them yesterday.
Yeah, I think we should remember that. The reason people think that is that the Soviets made major concessions in coming to the agreement. Reagan said, here it is, take it or leave it. And the Soviets kept saying, well, no, we can't. And they finally said, we'll take it. But what they had to give up on a lot of things in order to do that, from their point of view at least. And so that makes people think Gorbachev did this. Now, whether or not Americans believe that if Gorbachev is gone, the deal is out, I don't know. They shouldn't necessarily believe that. It depends on which faction is in power. If you get the Cold War hardliners in power after Gorbachev, hold on to the seat of your pants before they get blown away. That's an overstatement. It's not that bad. There'll be a lot more hardline. It'll be more like Brezhnev, keep pushing. If people in what Stephen Cohen, a Soviet specialist, calls the reformist camp, which Gorbachev is in, gets in power, and they go back a long line all the way to the 1920s and Nikolai Bukharin, if that faction is in power, then even if Gorbachev is out, you're going to keep having this kind of relationship. And it's in our interest, I think, to try to do what we can from our side to encourage along that faction staying in power.
I think what is happening, whether it's a revolution or not, we don't know for sure in a sense, but there is obviously a restructuring in a sense of international order. So if you look at international order, and if you look at three things, values, norms, and structures, we say we have to ask the question, are the values of the Soviets being changed, or the relationship between the Soviets and the Americans being changed? Number two, are the norms being changed? And finally, what kinds of systems are going to be instituted so these things can be carried out? So the question that is addressed is the one, will the system last beyond Gorbachev and Reagan? And so a new system, as you say, John, is being put into place. And it is a new system in terms of this openness of checking nuclear installations. So the question is, are the values changing? Will there be new norms implemented? And how long will the structures last, the institutions last, to carry these kinds of things out?
I think that it's partly values changing, but it's also that a set of values which has been a part of the historic stream of Soviet development from the very beginning, comes back to the fore. It's in and out. It was in part of the time with Khrushchev. He was very reformist in some respects. He emptied the Gulag Archipelago. Most Americans don't know that. He let out all the political prisoners because he was more in the line of Bukharin and Gorbachev. He was more reformist. Those values, well, he was kind of crude at it, but those values have been there all along. So they're back in the front again with Gorbachev. And so they're not exactly new, but there is, in that respect, but there are some new elements to it. In that Gorbachev, say, compared to Khrushchev, came from peasant background, and you could see it in his humor. You could see it in what he did to his friends. He made them dance crazy dances and embarrassed them to death on board ship when they were crossing back and forth to the United States for summit meetings. He could do those really ridiculous things. Gorbachev has a very different spirit about him. He's from what we would call upper middle class background. Graduated from the best university, University of Moscow, has a law degree. He is well off financially. Well, Khrushchev had quite a bit financially, but he came into it suddenly. Gorbachev has lived with it all his life, and I think that gives them a different kind of set of values. And Soviet leaders have always been afraid of being blown away by us. I think Gorbachev has a lot more to lose and therefore is more afraid of it. And I think in that sense you see a different set of values coming in.
Can the symbolism that we've talked about here, if not substance, at least the symbol of progress here, can that overcome all of the tough talk, the pre-summit posturing that was done as we traded insults, we talking about, among other things, human rights, the invasion of Afghanistan. I mean, these are pretty large issues still looming in the background, are they not? I mean, they don't disappear because we signed the IMF treaty.
No, they don't disappear, and the rhetoric will go on, I think, on both sides, but perhaps slightly less stridently than it has heretofore. Certain political groups in this country are not going to let President Reagan forget that, and he wouldn't anyway, I suspect, forget that there are human rights problems, there are problems in the Persian Gulf. There are problems in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States all over the world, and Central America being just one of those places. And that rhetoric will go on. Yeah. The linkage, so to speak, will be set. But it may be a little less strident. I haven't heard, I hadn't heard the president refer to the evil empire. I did hear a slight allusion to that the other night. I think there'll be less of that, and I suspect there'll be less of it from the Soviet side. But there are still domestic audiences that need to be stroked.
That's a good point, because that's what the rhetoric is about. When the Soviets say those things about us, they don't mean for the president to take it all that seriously. They mean for their hardliners to take it seriously. And when President Reagan says those things about the Soviets, he's talking more to his own right wing than he is to the Soviets. And the Soviets know that.
But there's a key difference, and that is that those Republicans who are running for office, they have to get the support of the Republican right to be able to get the nomination and then have a chance to get the White House. So it's a very different kind of public opinion ballgame.
The public opinion is important in the Soviet Union too, though.
The crucial thing, I think, in terms of American public opinion or politics, is that Reagan, as the conservative, can do the liberal thing. Reagan is the only person who really has the opportunity to do the conservative thing.
Yeah.
And essentially, in American politics, there are four political parties. One is the congressional Republicans, one is the congressional Democrats, another is the presidential Democrats, a fourth is the presidential Republicans.
At least for 88.
At least for 88.
Yeah.
And you have to ask which group is going to lose from this and which group has the potential to lose. And it seems to me it happens to be the congressional, the presidential Republicans, because they're the ones who have to face these very difficult issues of trying to get votes from the political right.
I think they're in pretty good shape so far, though. See, the Democrats have a hard time going after President Reagan or Bush now because they're agreeing with them about Soviet-American relationships. So how are they going to attack them in the upcoming race?
Well, excuse me, John, but in one sense, that's not as important as the relationship between Bush and his fellow Republican contender.
Until the nomination.
That's right. He doesn't have the nomination yet, as you
Sure
know.
he does.
And,
no, I don't know.
And so it's consequence he'll be having to fend off these people on the right.
That's right.
But Ronald Reagan can so much thumb his nose at conservatives if he wants to, Republicans, but George Bush still has to court those people.
If Reagan, if the president does thumb his nose, there'll be problems in the Senate, and there'll be problems with Bush in the nomination. So he can't be quite so, in my judgment, quite so free about that.
Is that opposition in the Senate among conservatives, and we must assume that that's going to be the only real opposition unless the Soviets do something crazy again, like invade like they did in invading Afghanistan. Is there really that much serious doubt that the Senate will ratify this?
Well, the Republican leadership in the Senate seem to think there's some doubt. How serious it is, I don't know. I haven't counted the votes. I don't know how tough it is.
Well, preliminary votes said that they saw about perhaps 20 hardline against it, but really not enough to defeat this.
But not now.
Larry, the word linkage, I guess, has been out of vogue, but I think this particular issue, a treaty has to be linked to longer-range nuclear missiles in terms of a treaty on that. It also, beyond that, has to be linked, of course, to conventional forces, and the conventional forces are the real, will probably be the real hang-up, if there is one, in this entire process.
Remind me to tell you about conventional forces sometime.
Well, tell us now.
Yeah, now's as good a time as any.
I have seen one direct reference on the public media to the possibility that the United States and the NATO alliance is stronger in conventional weapons than the Soviets. I think there is every good possibility that the United States and the Western powers are indeed stronger in conventional forces than the Soviets.
Well, I'm not sure that I can buy that. I know there's a lot of argument about definitions and numbers and ratios and all that sort of thing.
What they do is they compare tanks. They've got twice as many as we have. They never tell you how many anti-tank weapons we have and how good they are. They never tell you that, at least not more than one time that I can remember, that the Soviet military is almost 50% ethnic minority. Many of them don't even speak Russian. When those ethnic minority troops are stationed anywhere but the heartland of the Soviet Union, they do not carry weapons because their leaders don't trust them not to shoot them. They arm that minority force when they use them in the internal security forces because they know that those ethnic minorities with weapons will kill Russians. And if you understand what I'm talking about, the ethnically Russian people, who speak Russian and live there in the heartland. If they get out of line, like in public dissent, if it goes too far, the Soviets want to be sure their security forces will deal with that. And one way they have of making sure of that is arming those ethnic minorities who will put the B on those people if they need to. Now, if there is a war in the West, what are they going to do with that almost 50% of their military that's untrustworthy ethnic minority that may lean more toward sentiments like the Iranians, for example, than they do toward the Russians? And beyond that, in the Warsaw Pact, when we count the Warsaw Pact forces, how many of those forces are Polish? And how can you be sure? If the Soviet military is attacking Western Europe, how can you be sure what the Polish military and the Czech military is going to be doing? Well, the Soviets aren't sure.
It'd be foolish, of course, for us to say that we have all the problems and the Russians have none. I mean, that's just doesn't make any sense. Clearly, they have their sets of problems. You just did very clearly outline some of those. We have ours, and some of those are numbers.
I'm not saying they aren't a formidable threat. I'm saying that if you look at the numbers, even the numbers of weapons, and the potentials of those weapons, and especially if you look at the military forces, the troops, and how they're trained, you can't be so sure anymore that the sides are that unequal in conventional weapons. I think the Americans are very powerful in conventional forces. And when you add in the Europeans, they are extremely powerful. And if they're fighting the defensive side of the war, they, in a sense, have an advantage in the heartland of Europe.
I think the issue is that this issue is one that people do disagree on, and the conventional force concern is very much of a concern.
Sure it is.
As far as the numbers are concerned, if I can use that word concern for the time.
Sorry,
on this issue. You know, something else we can look at is that in terms of, since 1945, they've said in a sense that the Japanese and the Germans lost the war, but they won the peace. They won the economic peace. So since 1945, our competition when it comes to economics has been Japan and West Germany. In terms of military competition, however, and I think this is the reason this particular point is so very important, our military competition has been with the Soviets. So as the times have changed when it comes to economics and peace with Japan and West Germany, the times are now changing when it comes to our military opposition as far as that aspect is concerned. And for the fifth time I use the word concern. But that's going to be a very delicate kind of thing as we look at the INF Treaty, as we look at the long-range missiles, as we look at conventional forces. What is occurring now, if this is indeed revolutionary, to get back to our phrase, is that the military balance, the military restructuring is occurring, or perhaps is about to occur.
I think there's some economic pressure for that military restructuring to occur, especially on the Soviet side. They are not going to go broke. We can't break them with an arms race. Their system isn't going to fall because of the cost of an arms race. But they don't want the continued cost of that arms race because they can't do the things that the Gorbachev types want to do as long as they have the arms race. So I think he wants to restructure that kind of military competition. I think also Americans need to keep in mind when we think about working out relationships with the Soviets on a military level, that while we have all our nuclear weapons, as far as I know, aimed at the Soviets, they have to aim at least, say, a fourth or maybe a third of theirs at China. They spend about 20% of their defense budget on defending their Chinese border. Everybody else in the world who has nuclear weapons has them aimed at the Soviet Union, including China. Soviet Union has to aim at everybody else, including Muncie, incidentally. Indiana ought to know that there are maybe 100, 200, we don't know, different targeting plans, but most of the standard targeting plans in a nuclear war have targeted every American city above 10,000 in population. And I'm not talking about in the abstract. I'm talking about coordinates on maps, programmed in the missiles.
John, you bring up a good point because we always want to bring this program back to Indiana. Do you believe that Hoosiers support this treaty? You think
I'm
so?
here as a Soviet specialist.
Yeah.
I don't think they have. I don't think most Hoosiers have an opinion now. I think that in the end they will support the treaty.
Cautious support.
But I don't think that right now. Oh yes, we're all for it, and we're going to instruct our two senators to support the treaty. I don't think that's been done in that kind of definitive way yet. Perhaps you've seen poll data, John. I have not.
If we go back to those two phrases of openness and restructuring, I'm not too sure that Hoosiers do support the treaty, because I'm not sure Hoosiers would call for more openness in systems, and I'm not sure they would call for a restructuring of systems either, in terms of economic systems, political systems. I think they are conservative, and they will perhaps support it in the end if they see some positive results out of the whole
Could I just add this point, though, on the other side of that? Most of us who are Hoosiers want peace. In some ways, we think wishfully about peace. We've been told by our elected leader, and incidentally, as you recall, John, Indiana's gone for Reagan twice overwhelmingly. Mm-hmm. And we've been told by that president that this is a good deal, a good treaty with verification and all of that. So my feeling is that the Hoosiers will in the end support the treaty.
I think
so. I would agree from that point, from the point of view that Republican politics in this state is very pragmatic. It's not ideological usually. Mm-hmm. And it does, if there is some indication of economic advantage in terms of economic standard of living, I think that Hoosiers may indeed support the treaty.
Unless you're talking about perhaps a Dan Burton Hoosier who might be stay with his anti-communist hard line with the Russians and whoever else, the Ortegas of the world.
I think it's going to be difficult for any ideologue on the right to change, because it seems to me that their chief ideologue, Mr. Reagan, has changed his perspective.
I don't really think he has. I think around the edges he's changed, but at the heart of him, I think his values are still pretty much the same.
What's his motivation to sign this treaty? Is he writing his place in history?
I think that, he's always wanted peace and security, and he's always been worried about the Soviet threat, but I think he's been in office long enough to realize that there's a much greater threat to getting us all blown up than he ever realized. And I think he's found out that he has to use a different kind of method to keep that from happening.
And that's called change, John.
Yeah, but, I said, in a certain area around the edges, he's changed in his method. But I think at the heart of it all, he is still not terribly trusting of the Russians, and he still wants security. That's extremely important to him, and he wants military strength enough, to be sure of that.
And I don't think that's
changed.
And we're out of time. Thanks to our panelists, Tom Sargent, John Barber, John Rouse, for their commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Mike Seaborg, Bill Mosier, Nancy Carlson, and Steve Johnson. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.